He was a man who executed and took the lives of 3,165 people. The mention of the name Johann Reichhart used to send chills down the back of people inside of Nazi Germany, and this man was a generational executioner who became incredibly rich from the business of cutting heads off on a guillotine. But what is not as well known about this beast was that at the end of the Second World War, Reichhart was even deployed by the American forces to work as an executioner for the United States Army, who were hanging many men convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity inside prisons such as Landsberg. Reichhart, seemingly because of his obsession with execution, helped the enemies of the Nazis take the heads of his former political kinsmen, and this must have been a significant blow to the people of Germany. This was a Nazi executioner being ordered to execute Nazis, but Reichhart presumably also did this to avoid trial and possible execution himself. The end of his life was one which was plagued by regret, and he died inside of a psychiatric hospital, presumably haunted by the actions that he carried out for decades inside of Germany. But what is the story of the devout Nazi executioner who executed over 3,000 people? Today we look at the dark life and career of Johann Reichhart. To support our channel, please click subscribe, as it does really help keep the channel going. Johann Reichhart was born in Wichenbach within the Kingdom of Bavaria on the 29th of April 1893. Death and bloodshed was the family business, as his family were generational executioners and also knackers in the local area. A knacker was someone who was paid to remove and clear dead animal carcasses from towns, roads or wherever they were, and they were then paid to turn the byproducts of the death into glue, fats, soap and other ingredients. This was even described by the medieval people as a disreputable job and occupation, but many knackers were also commissioned by the courts to work as public executioners, specialising and dealing with death, not just of animals, but also being involved in the business of taking human life. Reichhart's family had been executioners for 8 generations. He knew nothing else of it. His brother was an executioner, as was his uncle, and they had been serving to Germany's capital punishment needs since the mid-1700s. His father worked as a master knacker, but as a young man, Johann Reichhart attended the local Volksschule, and he then went on to complete further education before completing an apprenticeship as, yep, you guessed it, a butcher. But as the First World War came around, he, like many millions of people inside of Germany, enlisted to serve on the front lines of the conflict as a soldier inside the German army. He saw much action, and upon his return from Flanders, Reichhart continued working as a butcher, but he then in 1924 took the position of the state judicial executioner inside of Bavaria, as his uncle Franz Reichhart retired at the age of 70. In this role, Reichhart was now overseeing executions, but for the first 4 years of his time in the job, he executed 23 people, as the executions slowed down in their number, and in 1928 he only executed 1. Shockingly, because of this, his family actually suffered financially, as he relied on the grisly business of taking heads to feed his family. He was paid 150 gold marks and 10 marks for daily expenses, such as food inside different towns, and he was also given a third-class train ticket to get to the prison where he would be executing. He tried to take on different jobs executing inside other nations, but he continued to be destitute because of the slowdown in the executions. He tried to begin a business using wagons to transport objects to different towns, and this then went downhill, as did an inn he opened. He continued to execute, but then moved to the Netherlands, and he opened up a greengrocer's shop. So he went from dealing with animal carcasses to then executing people, to then succeeding at selling vegetables to the people of the Netherlands. But inside of Germany, following his release from prison, there was a certain politician who was rising throughout the political spheres, and many people flocked to support the Nazis and Adolf Hitler. Membership for the Nazi Party began to rise in its hundreds of thousands, but during the early 1930s, Reichhart returned to Munich, where he carried out executions on the guillotine inside of Stadelheim prison. But in the Netherlands, his real job was reported, and because of this unpopularity, His business began to fail, and people then shopped elsewhere, and with this Reichhart returned to Munich in 1933. He at this point thought about leaving his job as an executioner behind him due to the negative press he had received, but luckily for him, the Nazis would come into power, and Johann Reichhart was offered a new bumper contract in the Bavarian Ministry of Justice. He was now given a better salary, which was paid annually, and he then also received a bonus when he carried out executions. It was under the Nazi Party that the business of executions boomed, but the macabre reality of this was that thousands of innocent people would be executed for their opposition of Hitler and the Nazis. Hitler agreed to dispense of older methods of execution, such as using an axe, but inside of Germany he settled on the use of the guillotine, but the German variant, the fallbeil, the all-metal German guillotine. This more compact device, when compared to the French guillotine, allowed men such as Reichhart to take the heads of people in just a matter of seconds from them entering the execution chamber. It's believed that Reichhart, who liked to experiment and innovate, even made his own fallbeil, and that he carried this device around with him on carts for his executions. Inside of the Nazi reign of terror, Reichhart even got a pay rise, and he joined a number of Nazi groups before joining the party officially in April 1937. He was responsible for executions in the city and areas of Munich, Dresden, Weimar and Stuttgart, and it was known inside of the Third Reich that Reichhart's work did take its toll on him, as he suffered with depression and the mental side of the job. Reichhart, as mentioned, did speed up the execution process that he performed and tried to make things easier for the condemned. He used a tipping board on the guillotine before, but he then used a fixed bench, allowing a few seconds' time to be shaved off the proceedings. But then on the fixed bench, the condemned would not be restrained. Reichhart's trusted assistants held the condemned tightly, and then Reichhart released a blade onto the neck of the victim. He did not use a blindfold upon his victims, his assistants instead holding the eyes of the person shut. With this, he was known to have been capable of executing someone in just a matter of 3 to 4 seconds. He continued to execute inside of German cities, and worked specifically also at Berlin's Plötzensee prison, in a site where over 3,000 people lost their heads or were hanged in the brick-built execution chamber of the courtyard of the prison. He was by all accounts a ruthless and efficient executioner, someone who, because of the sheer amount of executions he performed, also became incredibly rich. He even managed to buy himself a very lavish villa, and his family lived comfortably in Munich, but the reality was that all of this accumulated wealth came in because of people's lives who had been sentenced to death and taken by Reichhart and the Nazi state. Many of these people were good people who had fought persecution and repression, but these heroic people were, by the orders of the Nazi Party, to be executed for their treason. During the Third Reich's time in power, Reichhart executed 2,951 people, including around 250 who were women, including resistors such as Sophie Scholl. She was a member of the White Rose movement, and at the age of 21 she made her way into the execution chamber within Stadelheim prison. She met Reichhart in the chamber, who was stood by his guillotine, and within seconds her head had been taken off. Reichhart later described Scholl as the bravest person he ever had to execute. Reichhart also benefited hugely from the failed assassination plot on Hitler's life, the July 20th plot. There was a huge influx of people who would be executed, and with this Reichhart raked in the cash from the grisly actions of releasing the blade of the fallbeil. His children at school were taunted, as other children chanted, "Headcutter, your dad's a headcutter," and later one of his sons would take his own life, as he could not live with the legacy of his father. At the end of the Second World War, and following the collapse of the Nazi state, Johann Reichhart was arrested by American army forces, and he in May 1945 was locked up inside Stadelheim prison, the very site where he had taken the heads of many. He was offered a deal by the Americans, and they said if he helped them to execute Nazi war criminals, then he would face little action, if any. With this, he was employed officially by the US Office of Military Government for roughly a year, and in this he helped bring the lives of many convicted Nazi war criminals to an end. This included former concentration camp guards and convicted criminals who had taken the lives of prisoners of war. With this, Reichhart helped on the gallows, and he brought the life of many to an end inside of Landsberg Prison on the gallows. He utilised the long drop method, using a gallows with a trapdoor, and Reichhart had previously appealed to the Nazi Reich Ministry of Justice to use this method of execution inside Germany, but this was rejected. He continued to execute inside of Landsberg, releasing the trapdoor, and was filmed carrying out these executions for the Americans, but he then retired as an executioner and then served as a consultant. He would, it's believed, help John C. Woods, the bungling Nuremberg executioner, carry out some executions, and he helped to manage the gallows, but some claimed that he was not involved in the Nuremberg executions and in the construction of the gallows that failed to execute the Nuremberg Nazis effectively. In 1942, Reichhart was arrested again and was subjected to denazification trials, and he was sentenced to 2 years inside of a labour camp and had half of his property taken away. He claimed at his trial that, and I quote, "I have carried out death sentences in the firm conviction that I should serve the state with my work and to comply with lawfully enacted laws. I never doubted the legality of what I was doing." He had his sentence reduced slightly, and upon his release he became a recluse. No one wanted anything to do with Johann Reichhart, the Nazi executioner, and his wife left him, and he spent the rest of his life living in poverty. The only thing he had to support himself really was a measly pension from the First World War, but he would shockingly speak out against the use of executions. He spent his last few days inside of different psychiatric hospitals and died at the age of 78 on the 26th of April 1972. During his many decades as an executioner inside of Germany, Johann Reichhart executed 3,165 people. Most of these were condemned to death by the Nazi state and the People's Court, and they would be sentenced to death for the fact they resisted the regime of Hitler and they put up a fight. Reichhart spent the last of his days deeply psychologically affected by his work, but he was known for his efficiency and speed with his guillotine, and his innovations led to him becoming possibly the fastest executioner in history, being able to take the head off someone in just a matter of seconds. But our final thoughts must be with the victims of Reichhart. In this video we've given you a detailed rundown about his life and his dark story, but one man had over 3,000 victims. These victims were young, old, male, female, and all of them had dreams. Most of their dreams would have seen the crumbling end of the Nazi regime, but they were all denied this reality as the end of the Second World War came around, and they would never see it, becoming just tallies in the executioner's notebook of a man who ruthlessly released the guillotine blade and hanged so many people, so many brave people who became victims of one of the most evil regimes in history. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.